Now, tonight, a national treasure. John and I have only ever met twice. Once was in a general election studio in whatever year it was. Um, I think probably in Elstree. But since then, he actually writes for my books. He's written for, I think, 8 of my books, something like, including the BBC one, which is on sale upstairs. And he always delivers, always on time, and delivers very good stuff. So hence that. So I said to him, would you fancy coming to do this? He said, well, I'm in Cardiff, I've got to be in Glasgow, but I can do it in between. You've got also his CV in front of you, and he tells me paragraph 4 is total crap. So strike it out.
It's ancient history.
Yeah, ancient history, but the rest of it is all there. He's going to talk for about 25 minutes with lots and lots of charts. We're filming this as well, so it will be available on the My Jericho website, and I assume on the Bavadnik website as well. So I can say nothing to introduce John, please. He is the national treasure, the polling guru of Britain. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Yes, so although this... although this is billed as an in conversation, you don't get away with inviting me to come without there being a few graphs and a few slides and a few statistics. But be assured, this is the relatively short version of what I might say about this topic. But the honest truth is that we are in unusual times, unprecedented times, in the extent to which we have both Labour and Conservatives as being unpopular. It's something that political scientists like myself have been talking about for years. This is the share of the vote won by Conservative and Labour combined since 1922, which was the first election when the Labour Party displaced the Conservatives, displaced the Liberal Party as the principal competitor to the Conservatives. And you can see there, by the time we reached the early 1950s, virtually everybody voted either Conservative or Labour. So there was a reconsolidation of the party system, and we, in a sense, recreated the duopoly of Conservative versus the Liberal Party before the First World War. It was now replaced by a Conservative-Labour duopoly. Gradually, persistently, particularly from the 1960s onwards, the Conservative and Labour share of the vote began to fall. And I can find you many academic articles, particularly at the time of the foundation of the Liberal SDP Alliance in 1983, which was certainly, until to date, the most substantial challenge to the two-party system. You know, academics arguing about, well, why was this happening, and what might be the implications be. And then along came Jeremy Corbyn, who these days it's rather forgotten, actually did rather well in the 2017 election, although Theresa May managed to do better than him, although not as well as she'd hoped, and therefore she lost her majority. But in combination, the two of them actually managed to reverse that long-term historical pattern. And we wondered whether or not, indeed, you know, it was simply a secular trend, but, you know, it was all now being reversed. And of course, in particular, the Liberal Democrats got crucified by the electorate as a result of their involvement with the coalition with the Conservatives between 2010 and 2015. And then UKIP came, but UKIP imploded by 2017. It looked as though the challenge to the two-party system was over. But then in 2024, of course, the Conservatives fell to 24%, which is their lowest share of the vote since and including 1832. And meanwhile, although Labour, yes, won a parliamentary landslide, my wife will tell you that every time somebody on the radio or the television says, Labour won a landslide, I go, oh, no, they didn't. Because, of course, in terms of share of the vote, Labour only won 35%, which is the lowest share of the vote that has ever been sufficient to enable a party to get a overall majority of any kind, let alone one of 170. And so, as you can see, the implication of the two of them is that the share of the vote won by Conservative and Labour combined fell to below 60% for the first time since 1922. So the truth is, the 2024 election particularly the implosion of the Conservative Party and the way in which its brand had been destroyed by the last Parliament, and the very uncertain way in which Labour eventually managed to win the election, did kind of raise the question, so what's going to happen next? Where do we go from here? Well, we of course now have some idea of where we have gone since 2024, and the truth is that the collapse in the dominance of the Conservative and Labour parties has been even more manifest. The red line there, that is the Labour share of the vote on average in the polls month by month. And as you can see, it's gradually and persistently fallen. No previously newly elected government has lost as much support as so quickly and so early in its term of office. And Labour are at the moment running on average at 19% in the opinion polls. The Conservatives had a wee bit of a recovery in the autumn, and then they elected Kemi Badenoch as their leader, and that soon disappeared. And the Conservatives have been persistently running at around 18% since the 17-18% since the spring of this year. So between them now, Conservative and Labour have less than 40% support amongst those members of the public, and that's by no means all of them, who actually have a party preference. We have Reform that have now been in the lead ever since April. Although their share of the vote, it's only just over 30%, doesn't match what the Liberal SDP alliance achieved in the polls in late 1981, early 1982. They have now been in the lead for longer than the alliance ever were. And now, more recently, with the advent of Zach Polanski as the leader of the Greens, we can see that the Greens have now overtaken the Democrats, who are just basically still flatlining at around the 12-13% mark. So we are in unprecedented territory. We're now, in particular, we've got the two challenger parties, the two parties that are not part of our long-term post-war politics, between them commanding the support of nearly 45% of voters. This is, and between them, are certainly more popular than Conservative and Labour. So what I want to talk about is some of the reasons as to why this has happened, and some of the perhaps some of the implications of what we might uncover. And I'm going to cover four things. And in a sense, the message is this is the way in which four particular forces have coincided in such a way as to create this seemingly substantial challenge to our conventional two-party politics. Number one is going to be demography and the way in which the demography of party support has changed. The second is going to be about values and the way in which what are the values that people are expressing when they vote, how that has changed, not least in the wake of Brexit. And those are, as it were, kind of two long-term forces that are not particularly unique to the UK. We then come to the more contingent factors, one of which is the very substantial policy challenges that are facing government, have faced government certainly since the financial crash of 2008 to 9, but now have been made worse by the COVID pandemic, the Russian-Ukraine war, etc., and the way in which the UK now has low growth, is fiscally challenged, public services don't work, and the question is, how do we get out of that bind? And then finally, leadership. Individuals matter in politics, and we'll say just a little bit about that towards the end. So, first of all then, demography. Peter Pulitzer, the late Gladstone professor of politics at this university, famously wrote in the late 1960s, "Class is the basis of British politics, all else is embellishment in detail." That is no longer true. As you can see in 2024, AB, by the way, that's basically professional and managerial folk. C1, more junior, white-collar folk. C2, skilled working class. DE, less skilled working class. What I invite you to note as you cast your eye from left to right along both the Conservative and the Labour lines, that the percentage numbers, not the change numbers, the percentage numbers are pretty much the same as you go from left to right. In other words, there is now no relationship between social class and whether or not you vote Conservative or Labour. That fundamental demographic anchor has disappeared. It actually disappeared finally in 2019. And as you can see, basically, therefore, the changes in support for the parties have not changed much. Actually, if anything, Labour's support rose slightly more amongst middle-class folk than working-class folks. Deborah Mattison was at an event I was talking at in London on Tuesday evening, and was saying, oh, well, the foundation of Labour's success was getting being able to appeal to working class voters. And I maybe not quite so gently, suggested to her that maybe she might want to look at a little bit of polling evidence, because frankly, and this is just one of many sources I could show you to show you that that is not true, which is the party that is relatively successful amongst the working class. It is Reform. That's certainly not something that Labour like. And the party that is relatively popular amongst the middle class, it always has been, is the Liberal Democrats. But they're both relatively mild gradients. So the fundamental demographic anchor of our two-party system has gone. It's been replaced by one, age. Age is the biggest demographic division in our society. It was there before Brexit, but Brexit has managed to fuel it further. As you can see, the Conservative Party does much better amongst older voters. The same is also true by Reform last year. And I'll show you where we are at the moment. Labour, more popular amongst young voters, but being challenged by the Greens amongst the youngest cohort. Most, of course, were people who hadn't voted back in 2019. But notice, therefore, how Labour, the Greens, and to some degree the Liberal Democrats are getting the young folk, and the Conservatives and the Reform between them are getting the older folk. The other crucial division is education. Again, in part, this is the product of Brexit, because it was young people and graduates that voted against Brexit and everybody else voted in favour. But again, notice that the Labour Party is most popular above all amongst people with university degrees. If I give you the data for 20 years ago, if anything, Labour tended to be slightly less popular. University graduates were a little bit lefty, but nothing like as lefty as they are now, so far as their voting behaviour is concerned. And the Conservative Party, again, fundamental long-term change, is, if anything, more popular amongst those who have less in the way of education, again, because that's the group that particularly voted for Brexit. And again, that is then also replicated in the pattern of support for Reform. So both these two new divisions, which are in part at least a product of the Brexit divide, are now much more clearly demographic anchors. But Brexit, as I've already suggested, disrupted our politics, and it certainly disrupted the patterns of support for Conservative and Labour. We don't talk a lot about Brexit, but it still very strongly shaped how people voted in 2024. Yes, Labour had a bit of relative success amongst Leave voters, but it was relatively mild. Support for Reform, basically, they're virtually all people who had voted for Brexit or would vote for Brexit now. The Conservative Party still managed to hang on to some of them. We'll see where we're at the moment in a moment. But as you can see, overwhelmingly, 3/4 of Leave voters were still voting for Conservative or Reform. Meanwhile, very few rejoiners were voting in that direction. And as I've already suggested, the point about Brexit, the demography is different. The demography of support is related to age and to education, but so also is the ideological base of what Brexit was about. Brexit was not an argument about the size of the state or really about the extent of inequality in our society. Yet that has been the traditional ideological meat and drink of our politics. Essentially, if you were on the left, you felt that society was too unequal and you thought the state should be doing something about it, and you're therefore more likely to vote for Labour. If you were on the right, you said, no, what the state needs to do is to provide the incentives for entrepreneurs to invest. That means the economy will grow faster, from which everybody will be able to profit, the proceeds of growth, as David Cameron once put it. That divide is still there. What I'm showing you on the left-hand side here is an indication of the way in which, whether you're not on the left or you're on the right, made a difference to how you vote. So if I take, for example, the 25 there, this is Labour. So that's saying to you that people who are on the left, and I'm using a measure which I won't go into detail now, but the people who are on the left were 25 points more likely to vote Labour in 2024 than people on the right. And conversely, people who are on the right, as I have defined it, were 31 points more likely to vote Conservative than people on the left. In contrast, Liberal Democrats, whether you're on the left or the right, make no difference at all. The Greens, definitely more popular amongst those on the left, but for reform, again, this doesn't really matter very much, just very slightly more popular amongst right-wing voters. But then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you, again, the same kind of analysis, but here dividing people according to where they stand on, it's sometimes called libertarian authoritarian issues, it's sometimes called social liberals versus social conservatives, or perhaps at its simplest, it's the culture wars dimension. It's the folk who are concerned about immigration, who are skeptical about equalities policies, who think that society should be imposing its moral code on its members. That, in other words, we need to have a degree of the state keeping society together in order to maintain social cohesion. In contrast, libertarians, social liberals say, no, what moral code you follow is up to you. It's a woman's right to choose, for example. What mores you follow is up to you. What sense of identity you have is up to you. It doesn't matter whether you speak English or not. And we're not really concerned about immigration. This is the other dimension. Now, that dimension's always been a little bit there in our politics. It tended to define Liberal Democrats as opposed to Conservatives. And as you can see, the Liberal Democrats are more popular amongst social liberals. The secret's in the name. Whereas they're in the middle on the left-right dimension. Now, what you also then notice, what defines reform? What defines reform voters is their social conservatism, right? They are Brexiteers, and because they're Brexiteers, they are also social conservatives. And that's why reform talk about things like equalities policies and immigration and about whether or not we should be apologising for our past as an empire and all the rest of it. That is what defines them. The Greens are, again, social liberals. Labour are now their votes primarily social liberal, whereas if I'd shown you the same graph for the beginning of this century, Labour support was basically just as high amongst authoritarians as it was amongst libertarians. So Brexit has changed the character of Labour's support. Labour Party's tried to reject it. So now the other thing you need to realise is this. Whether or being on the left or on the right does not tell you whether somebody is a social liberal or a social conservative. Think of the current Home Secretary. She is economically on the left, but she is a social conservative. Right? And basically, these two dimensions cut across each other. And therefore, it's much more difficult to maintain a two-party system when basically you've got four quadrants that matter to our politics, each of which potentially can be mined. And basically, the Greens are mining the left liberal quadrant, and the Reform are primarily getting a lot of the authoritarian quadrants, but particularly those, more so those in the right social conservative quadrant. And Conservative and Labour are trying to bridge the two and are struggling. So that's the second dimension. The ideology of our politics has changed. It's become two-dimensional. The third thing then is about the policy challenges. This is one of many examples I could show you as to how our confidence in how we're being governed has gradually been eroded over the long run, particularly since the first years of the new Labour government. The new Labour government, which did a lot of constitutional reform, succeeded in persuading people that actually we'd changed the way in which we were governed and that things were now much better. But since then, the orange line is telling you the percentage of people who say, The way in which Britain is governed needs a great deal or quite a lot of improvement. And you can see this has been gradually and persistently going up. And indeed, particularly what's quite noticeable is how the 2024 election had less elections are good for trusting politics. People trust their politicians for 5 minutes. But the 2024 election had very, very little impact on this measure. And you can see it's higher than it has been after any previous election. Now, why does this matter? Well, because as you can see, the level of support for reform and for the Greens is higher amongst people who are unhappy about the way this country is being governed. And a lot of us are unhappy. So this is now where the ideology, as it were, is the landing place. It's the magnet that draws people to these parties. But the thing that's pushing them in that direction is the deep discontent and lack of confidence in both of our two traditional governing parties. And the next few slides show you this in a certain amount of detail. I'll talk through this one quite quickly because if you understand this slide, you'll understand the rest of the lecture, or virtually all the rest of it. But it's just a little bit complicated. So let me explain. I'm now looking forward. I'm moving forward from 2024. This is dated from the spring of this year, by which time Reform were doing well ahead and Labour were well down. I am dividing voters, looking at 2024 Labour voters, okay? And I'm dividing them up according to their perception of how well the economy is doing. The folk on the left-hand side of the first quadrant of voters or histograms are the folk who think the economy is getting a lot worse. Only 1 in 4 of 2024 Labour voters who think the economy is getting worse are willing to vote Labour again. Conversely, the fourth quadrant are those folk who think the economy is getting better, and 3/4 of them are willing to vote Labour again. In other words, people's perceptions of the economy matter. But what you will also notice, for example, that support for reform, is higher, and people are more likely to switch from Labour to reform if they are unhappy with the state of the economy. So support for reform, yes, it's ideological, but it's also being driven by our discontent by the way in which we're being governed. So that big steep bar is saying to you the economy matters. I can do the same thing for health and our perceptions of the health service, which again are even many Labour voters don't think the health service is doing terribly well. We are much less willing to vote. Labour voters are much less willing to vote Labour again if they think the health service is doing badly. And notice again how reform in particular are able to pick up support amongst those who are unhappy with the state of the health service. We can do the same thing on immigration. Actually, perceptions of immigration are not as strongly related to defecting from Labour. The same was true actually of the Conservatives before 2024. But you can see that the folk who think that immigration is now a lot higher are less willing to vote Labour again. And this very much defines the destination. So if you are an ex-Labour voter and you're concerned about, you think immigration is a lot higher, then you do switch to reform. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, look, he could have said that 30 years ago. Sure, things are going badly. Government loses votes. But now watch the next bit, and this which begins to show you why the two-party system is in trouble. This is 2024 Conservative voters. It's the same kind of analysis, but now 2024 Conservative voters. So these are the 24% you think would never, ever go anywhere else. And again, I'm breaking them down according to their perception of how well the economy is doing. So the folk on the left-hand side are the folk who think the economy is getting a lot worse, amongst whom only 43% of 2024 Conservatives are willing to vote Conservative again. To their right are the folk who think the economy is at least doing okay, where 55% are willing to vote for the Conservatives. This is not what we normally expect. We normally expect if voters are going away from the government because they're unhappy about something, they will go to the opposition. They're not. 2024 Conservative voters are still inclined to blame the Conservative Party for the state of the country. And notice, where do they go? They go to reform. We can do the same thing on the health service. The Tories are still being blamed for the state of the health service, although it doesn't quite so strongly demarcate who is going to reform. And on immigration, yep, if people think that immigration is going up and is voted Conservative in 2024, they are now much more likely to switch to reform. So the point, therefore, is it's not just the government that's being blamed for the state of the country, so also are the opposition. And indeed, actually, if you look at what reform voters say when they're asked, how much do you trust Kemi Badenoch or Keir Starmer to deal with the economy, to deal with health, to deal with immigration, they give them both a big thumbs down. Indeed, how much of a thumbs down it is, if I also go on to tell you that reform voters are less likely than Conservative supporters to say that Labour can handle these issues, and they are less likely than Labour supporters to say that the Conservatives can handle these issues. In other words, they really are the folk who have lost confidence in both Conservative and Labour. Which takes us to our fourth and final issue, which is leadership. And the truth is, we don't have any popular leaders anymore. But Keir Starmer was never a popular politician. He was always less popular than his party before the election. And this is what's happened since. His net favourability has fallen away very heavily. He is even less popular than his party, and his party is not as popular as it once was. And indeed, if you take Ipsos's data, Keir Starmer is now the most unpopular Prime Minister in polling history. We might want to discuss in the Q&A as to why that is, but the truth is that Keir Starmer has struggled to impress upon the public the idea that he can provide the country with leadership. So, where does that therefore mean we are now on some of the things that I showed you at the beginning? I'm only going through one or two of them. This is where we are now on the relationship between how you voted in 2016 and how you would vote in an election now. There is one really crucial statistic, and this is the one statistic to take away from the evening, all right? Amongst those people who voted for Leave in 2016, support for reform is currently running at 54%. They really are the Brexiteers. Essentially, what Reform have done, they have taken the Johnsonian coalition of 2019 and they've whipped it from right up from underneath the Conservatives' feet. Notice, meanwhile, how Labour support is just fracturing in both directions. They're losing the Remainers and the Leavers. And remember, these are indicators of where people stand on the cultural wars issues. And the gains that are being made by the Liberal Democrats and by the Greens is already clearly coming primarily from those at the social liberal end of the spectrum. So the centre cannot hold, and everything is falling further towards the further ends of the ideological spectrum. This is where we are on vote by age. Support for reform is now very clearly much stronger amongst older voters. And you can see how the Greens are by far and away the most popular party amongst those 18 to 24. And actually, if you put these two numbers together, the Greens are just now the most popular party amongst under 50s. So basically, we have a generational divide. Amongst the over 50s, Reform are ahead, and amongst the under 50s, the Greens are just ahead. Age is now even more important in our politics. And then finally, a little bit more complicated, but the story is simple. Of course, one of the things that we've always said about the two-party system is that the first-past-the-post system would always keep it in place. Well, actually, last year, the first-past-the-post system did the Conservatives no favours at all. Their vote fell more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. That helps to explain why they ended up with just around 120 seats rather than about the 240 they might otherwise have got. What I'm doing here is taking one of those recent, clever multiple regression and post-stratification polls. So basically, they give you an idea of how the electoral geography might be shifting as compared with last elections. Notice, look at the Conservative column. And the first two rows are the seats that the Conservatives still hold. What do you notice? Their votes falling more heavily in places that they currently still manage to hang on to. And then look at the Labour column. So it's the third one, and then look at the fifth and the sixth and the seventh row. These are all places where Labour are first with different competitors in second place. Labour votes falling much more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. So if you want to know why occasionally you're reading about polls that say the Conservatives might end up with about 20 seats and Labour about 80, this is why. Because at the moment, at least, the parties are, because they're losing so much support, they're losing support in such a way that the first-past-the-post system is likely to make their position even more difficult than it would be otherwise. So, I won't go through all of this. As I said at the beginning, there are four things. Now, not all these things necessarily needed to have occurred together. We could have had a charismatic prime minister. There is no guarantee that the fact that we are in the policy challenges that we are in the wake of politics being changed by COVID, by Brexit, those two things needn't necessarily follow one on top of the other. But they have done, and they have left this very, very substantial challenge to both the Conservatives and to Labour.
Crystal clear. I'll ask about 3 or 4 questions and you have a chance. Those of you who've come to these things know that if you want to make a statement, there's a police station down the road. But please make your questions questions, not statements. So, John, May's coming up. The local here, Wales, Scotland. What's going to happen?
You're asking me to forecast now, John. That's much more difficult. Well, I mean, my answer to is that if the polls, if the support for the party remains as it is, and the polls are at least roughly right, and the evidence of last year's county council elections, so far as England's concerned, is that they are indeed roughly in the right place. It is that, well, let's take the easy ones first of all. The SNP will remain by far and away the largest party at Holyrood, because Reform are splitting the unionist vote north of the border. The SNP are still much less popular than they were 5 years ago. So John Swinney is likely to remain First Minister in Scotland, probably with a pro-independence majority, but not with an SNP majority. In Wales, where I was last night, it's a battle between, well, Labour are heading for probably, at the moment at least, their first defeat in Wales since 1931. And it looks as though at the moment, though it's a battle between Reform and Plaid Cymru, and that's what the Caerphilly by-election, in a sense, appeared to confirm. Though Labour are not so far behind Plaid that they couldn't still potentially be in the mix. But at the moment, Labour are at risk of losing out very, very badly. And although Reform might end up being the largest party in the Senate, they won't be able to get a First Minister elected because only the Tories will be willing perhaps to vote for a First Minister. So therefore, Rhys Iorwerth is almost undoubtedly going to be the next First Minister of Wales, the relation between Labour and Plaid will be reversed. Hitherto, Plaid have played the handmaiden to a Labour administration. Now it will be the other way around, which does therefore mean that with Michelle O'Neill as First Minister in Belfast, we will have nationalist First Ministers in all 3 devolved parts of the UK. That was kind of not what devolution was meant to be about, all right? In England, well, of course, it's a very large set of elections, not least because all of London is voting. London, of course, is not going to be good territory reform because it's full of Remainers. There, the question is, how well do the Greens do? It's because it's Polanski's territory. And there is a prospect of Labour losing an awful lot of seats, particularly in inner London, with reform perhaps picking up in some of the outer boroughs like Havering and Bexley, etc., which are rather different from the rest of London. And then what we will be looking in particular then thereafter is once we get outside of London, we're getting into lots of more territory where it voted Leave, Labour hold the local constituency and indeed the local council. And the question is, how much damage do reform do? And that's the other thing we will be looking at, because we had very little of that in May of this year. But if things are as they are at the moment, Labour are at risk of getting a drubbing in London, which is now their strongest area in the whole of the UK, and a drubbing in Wales, which historically was the place where they could never lose. You can see why that might not be very good for news for Keir Starmer.
All right, forecast even further. July 29.
Oh, no. Look. Anybody who remembers the 2019 to 2024 Parliament will know that you should never, ever forecast the outcome of a general election on the basis of what happened in the first 2 years. So the first 2 years of the last Parliament, the Conservatives were never, ever behind Labour consistently in the polls. And along came Partygate, and the rest is history. I think all I would say to you, the implication of my remarks this evening is that I do not think that either Reform or the Greens are going to disappear, and that probably the fragmentation of our politics is going to remain with us. But how that then plays out, given the vagaries of it would depend on the geography, it could depend on quite small margins, and also, as there's a lot of speculation on the extent to which voters do or do not manage to vote tactically. But at the moment, at least, probably your safest bet, if you're going to make any kind of bet, would be to say that no party gets an overall majority.
What does Keir Starmer have to do to recover from 16%? Or whatever he's at the moment?
Well, basically, it's kind of the implication remarks is one, first of all, to learn how to be a politician. The Keir Starmer's problem, and it's not unique to him. Everybody's saying this now, is that Keir Starmer doesn't have a story about what his government is about. We don't know what is the kind of country that Keir Starmer wants to create.
What's his Starmerism?
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the ways I put it is essentially Starmer's pitch has been, hello, I'm your local friendly plumber. I gather you've got a few leaks in your policy pipes, so I'm going to mend them, right? And of course, as with all friendly local plumbers, those leaks proved to be a bit more difficult to mend than they imagined. And there are still quite a few wet patches around. And of course, actually, what the local plumber didn't realise is that actually what the person wants to do is they want to sell the house and they want a new one, and they want a nice architect to build them a nice new one. And the point is that Starmer hasn't presented an architectural vision of the kind of Britain he wants to create. It's fundamental to politics about having a story about what you're about. And the point about both, Starmer just, the word that people use is boring and bland, right? Okay, he just doesn't excite people. Whereas, whatever you think of them and whatever your views, both Farage and Polanski, A, have a vision, which B, they articulate, and they do so in such a way that grabs people's attention. They've got a story and they've got charisma. And, there's, again, it's coming by marks at the end, there's nothing inevitable about suddenly having this happened at both ends of the spectrum, but it has happened. So therefore, you do have at the two ends of the spectrum, two politicians that seem to have a particularly good ability to take advantage of the structural weakness that the two largest parties currently face.
If Labour changed leader to West Street would it make a difference?
Well, in part, the answer to that is it depends on how you get from here to there and whether you can do so successfully. Streeting is definitely a much more effective communicator, but he's not ideologically very different from Starmer. But the question would be, can he use that ability to command the attention of the public and also to come up with a bit of a story? I think the downside is, shall we say, his tenure in the Department of Health is proving to be quite bruising. I mean, the decision to get rid of Health England has not been entirely uncontroversial. And, whether or not it was a good idea to try and restructure the health service when you're desperately trying to get waiting times down, is debatable. So I think there's still a question mark about his ability to govern effectively, but certainly he's a much better communicator.
We'll talk about television and election night in a while. Hands up if you want a question. The gentleman in the back who was first, yes. Would you stand up, please, and shout?
Thank you. Who's your favourite PM and Chancellor in the last 50 years? And if you could wave a magic wand, who would you put in number 10?
I'm afraid you're hitting my impartiality rules, I'm afraid. I'll happily say to you that, if we just take my criteria of communication, for example, right? So who are the politicians, at least during my lifetime, who became Prime Minister, who have been effective communicators? One is undoubtedly Harold Wilson, another is Margaret Thatcher, and another is undoubtedly Tony Blair, okay? But equally, the charisma has not been entirely confined to First Ministers. And both Jeremy Thorpe and Paddy Ashdown were, again, very effective communicators. And they had the kind of ability to reach out to the electorate that certainly a third party needs. You will notice I have carefully ensured that I have mentioned people from all of our political parties. Oh, and and I've already told you that Farage and Polanski have got it, okay?
There's a lady here, yes.
Labour unions. I'm not supposed to make a statement, but I spent 10 years on the shop floor in a big Sainsbury's supermarket.
Yeah.
And I would say nobody belonged to the union, or very, very few, because they felt the unions no longer had any part of their lives. And of course, you had to pay something to belong to the union. In the downfall of the Labour Party, that enormous bundle of belonging, that feeling of belonging, has all been lost.
Well, the character of the trade union movement has fundamentally changed. So the trade union movement is no longer an set of organisations that primarily represent men and men in skilled working class jobs. The trade union movement now primarily represents women, and it represents women in public sector jobs. It's very much stronger in the public sector than the private sector, which is one of the reasons why the difficulties of maintaining the labour market is proving to be more difficult inside the public sector than the private sector. So it's a very, very different creature. But it's not anything like as strong as it was in the 60s and 70s. But it's still got enough clout, particularly financial clout.
Within the Labour Party?
Yeah, it's got a clout within the Labour Party, and it's certainly got a financial clout in terms of helping the Labour Party to be able to raise funds.
This gentleman here.
Your graph earlier on showed that the Lib Dems are effectively flatlining.
Yeah.
Why are they not taking advantage of the loss of support to Labour and Conservatives?
I think it's a fundamental question that Ed Davey should be asked. If you get Ed Davey coming up to support Layla Moran, ask him the question. The Liberal Democrat strategy worked in the last election, which is essentially to focus on constituencies that the Conservatives were defending and basically to bet the farm on the unpopularity of the Conservative Party. Worked brilliantly, right? Particularly because also voters were willing to vote tactically, and that, together with Reform's ability to take loads of Conservative votes, allowed the Liberal Democrats to get to that record tally of 70-odd seats. However, the problem they've now got is that they've basically whipped all of the blue wall. There are only about 20 seats left where they start off second to the Conservatives. And there are only 6 constituencies where they're second to Labour. And yeah, as you're basically alluding to, what they didn't do in 2024 and still done, the party's support is still remaining persistently much lower than it was at any point between 1974 and 2010. They have not recovered from, in terms of votes, the damage that was done during the Cameron coalition years. And I think, I've written this elsewhere, is that the challenge of the Liberal Democrats now is to actually remake itself as a national party, and a national party that is capable of challenging an unpopular Labour government in the way that the Liberal Democrats were able to do during the years of New Labour.
Yes, gentleman at the back, the young man, stand up.
It looks like the negative perception of Donald Trump has affected elections in Australia and Canada. How's the perception of Donald Trump here in the UK affecting voting intention?
Is Trump affecting the British voting intention? We had a reform thing 2 nights ago, and the man who used to be Trump's PR man said that Farage wasn't Britain's Trump, but Trump was America's Farage. Farage got there first.
So, the short answer to is it doesn't seem to have made that much difference so far. The folk who back reform do have, there's some work done by colleagues on the National Centre for Social Research. The attitudes that define Trump supporters also are and what I've been talking about this evening, also define reform supporters. So to that extent, at least, the folk in the UK who are most likely to think that Trump's a good idea are the folk who are backing Farage. So it's not necessarily that negative.
This gentleman there, yes, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir John. Fantastic talk. You're clearly saying the two-party system is finished. But
I know. I think the point is it's a valid question to be asked.
Do you think the parties know enough about fighting a battle to win support when there are multiple tribes rather than just 2 tribes?
No, they're in uncharted territory, and one of my abiding memories of the 2024 election campaign was the first of the leaders' debates, where, as it so happened, because they drew by lots, Penny Mordaunt, who was representing the Conservatives, and Angela Rayner were next to each other at one end, and all the other 5 leaders were then arranged around them. And Rayner and Mordaunt spent the evening arguing with each other and ignoring everybody else. And I was going, hang on, you do realise it's not the Tories that are your problem, Labour. It's the Greens, it's the SNP. And for the Penny Mordaunt, you do realise it's Nigel Farage down the other end that you've got to do something about. It's not Labour that's causing you the damage. But of course, the truth is that politicians can often find it very, very difficult to change their mindsets. And whether or not the Conservative and Labour leadership, whatever it proves to be in the coming years, will be able to adapt and be effective in dealing with the situation in which they now find themselves is going, the answer is not necessarily so. Therefore, one of the reasons for doubts about their future.
Thank you. Lady in row 3 or 4 here, yes.
I've sort of got 2 questions, really. One is, what about Jeremy Corbyn's big following?
Yeah, sure.
And the other is, what are the prospects, do you think, of getting some sort of nod about changing to proportional representation?
Okay. On Corbyn's U Party, it's fairly clear from such polling has been done that they would do most damage to the Greens, next most damage to Labour, least damage to the Liberal Democrats, and therefore if they were to insist and stand and were to get the support they got, they would help to pave the way for Nigel.
Shambles, aren't they, John?
Well, I was going to avoid all that stuff, all right? But the point is, if they were to be successful, they would make Nigel Farage's life easier. Okay, and you can see therefore why Polanski doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility of somebody, because they're both appealing to the same constituency of voters. On electoral reform, well, it won't happen, I think, if we do get the hung parliament after the next election, in which the Liberal Democrats and or the SNP have bargaining power, then it might happen. All I can say to you at the moment is that British society has detected a substantial change in public attitudes. Historically, the question we have asked has always got a majority of people in favour of keeping the current system. That began to change during the last parliament, not least because Labour voters began to come out in favour. The fascinating thing about the data for 2024 is, so Liberal Democrats in favour, well, you wouldn't have guessed that. Green voters in favour, you would guess that. Reform voters in favour, well, because until now at least they thought it was in their interest. We'll see how that changes. Labour voters were still in favour despite the way in which the election system benefited them. But the coup de grace is Conservative supporters are now also in favour of electoral reform. They've suddenly learned that those who live by the sword can die by the sword. It's clear that public attitudes have shifted, but whether or not how stable it will be, and I don't think it's going to get picked up until we get to a minority government situation where the bargaining can take place.
So here I had a question. Yes, my Australian friend.
I'm interested in tactical voting.
Yeah.
It was reckoned that Plaid won the Caerphilly election in part because of strong tactical voting to keep reform out of the vote.
It is claimed, but there is absolutely no evidence one way or the other as to whether that's happened.
Well, my question was going to be, can you somehow quantify the role of tactical voting? Doesn't it make it very difficult to interpret all of the statistics that you've given us tonight? If people say they will vote Labor, but only if we don't have this likely alternative.
It's certainly true that the Labour Party are hoping that, and one of the reasons why they're trying to frame the contest as between Labour versus Reform is they think that will help them to benefit. It's very, very difficult at this stage of a parliament to do because most decisions to vote tactically are made very late during the day. And in fact, one of the things that was hidden in the penultimate graph I showed you is actually how in places where tactical voting took place last year, it's unravelling. So there'll be people who voted for Layla Moran in Oxford West, who if I were to ask them what they would vote for, they'd say they'd vote Labour, right? Okay. And, so that all unravels at this stage.
Like me, John.
Well, that's for you to say. So the point, but the hypothetical evidence is that I've seen, particularly from YouGov, is that yes, it's true that if you say to Liberal Democrat and Green supporters, what would you do if you thought it was Labour versus Reform in your constituency? A fair chunk of them say they would switch to Labour. But ask the same question, Conservative voters, many of them say they will switch to Reform. And the net effect of the two things is it's a bit more than zero, but it's not a great deal more than zero. Put it like this. I think even if some of it happens, and it's perfectly conceivable it will happen, it's not really going to matter if Labour are at 19% of the vote. If it's Labour at 25 and Reform at 25, it might matter. But unless and until Labour have got their general popularity up, they're not going to survive on the basis of second preferences.
Years ago, sociologists used to talk about shy Tories. Are they now?
No, that's a journalistic myth, John.
Is it?
Right?
Are they shy reformers now, though?
There is a debate going on in the polling industry as to whether or not some of the polls are underestimating Reform. My view is that the evidence of the county council elections last year is that basically the polls are in roughly the right place. And again, Runcorn and Caerphilly again and you just look at. There are loads of local by-elections going on, and Reform are either coming first or second, and it's very, very clear that there is this very quite substantial tide of opinion.
This gentleman here has been taking copious notes. So yeah, good.
If the SNP are coming back in Scotland in a big way, what are the implications of that for support for independence?
Okay, so the SNP are not coming back in a big way. What has happened is that support for the SNP is largely held steady from last year, but support for the Labour Party has collapsed as it has done elsewhere. And the problem for Labour in north of the border is Labour is more vulnerable to reform north of the border, right? Because Labour's vote north of the border is A, less left-wing, and B, consists of more people who voted of Conservative in either 2017 or 2019.
Solid working class.
Labour was particularly successful at winning over Conservative voters in Scotland at the last election. Labour did very well in Scotland, right? But because they are conservative, they're people who are willing to vote Conservative, often tactically against the SNP. They are also vulnerable to reform. So Labour are losing more ground to reform than they are to anybody else north of the border. But virtually nobody who voted for the SNP last year has switched to reform. Okay, so it's fractured the unionist vote. It leaves the SNP still with only around 2/3 of the support of people who support independence. But because the majority of the seats for Holyrood are elected by first past the post, it will be like what happened to Labour last time. They'll get 50, 55, 60 or so of the 73 first past the post seats. And that will be enough to ensure that they will be running in the next government, probably a minority government, probably a bit more of a minority at the moment. However, what will probably be true is although the SNP themselves won't get an overall majority, the SNP and the Greens probably will. And while there being a pro-independence majority at Holyrood is not a sufficient condition for an independence referendum, it is a necessary condition. So the other thing about a hung parliament in 2029 is the issue would remain live. And if the SNP have bargaining power in a future hung parliament, it can be exercised because there would be the pro-independence majority at Holyrood.
Gentleman at the back, yes. Stand up if you don't mind, yeah.
If we change the discussion a bit, you made a statement that there are no popular leaders. So what is it in our times that we cannot produce political leaders?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not going to make myself really unpopular, right? Okay. So in part, I think it's to do with the pathway that many of our politicians have taken to become MPs, okay? So the pathway is this. They do PPE here, preferably at Balliol. When they've graduated, many of them with a first-class degree, they go off and they work for a think tank, Policy Exchange, IPPR, whatever. And they're clever chaps and chapesses. So they get quite expert at policy, right? And then after a while, they get friendly with an MP, and the MP says, "Will you come to be my research assistant?" So I become the MP's research assistant. Said MP, after a while, is going up the government gravy train and says, "Would you like to be my SPAD?" So he's now a SPAD, and he's got policy expertise, right? And then by this time, the MP, who by this stage is very clearly this politician's patron, says, "I know that Sir Oliver Bumblebee is about to stand down in Berkshire North. I know the chairman of the constituency party. Would you like me to put in a word for you?" And all of a sudden, our very, very clever Oxford graduate is an MP for Berkshire North. He's very clever, or she, know a lot about policy, but strangely along the way, despite the fact that their whole career has been in politics, they've had virtually no experience of communicating with the general public. And if you look through the career pathway of many of our politicians, now I grant you this doesn't fit Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is into his second career, but the point about lawyers is that they prosecute a brief that somebody's written for them, and when you're a leader, you've got to be able to write your own brief, and that's what Keir Starmer doesn't seem to be able to do. So the skill set doesn't quite work. And again, he grills people in court. Again, it's not dealing with the general public. So the problem we seem to have is we have a lot of politicians who I think they don't have that communicative ability, and I almost feel that some of them, they should have become civil servants. They would have been excellent civil servants. They know about policy. They care about policy. And of course, if you're in the civil service, you rely on the politicians to do the communication. But we just seem to have a dearth at the moment.
So Tories and Labour.
No, it's both. Yeah, I just chose one, obviously, Tory archetype, but the same, I could equally do the same thing. Particularly if, the patron is also a member of Unite, and Unite have got a lot of influence in a particular constituency, the same story applies.
Come to you in a minute. Oxford, you're back here. This is where your formative years.
Yeah.
What was it like? You went to Magdalen and Nuffield and...
Well, it was a life-changing experience.
Working class background?
Working class and public school, so, you can argue about it. It was the direct grant system for those of you who know about it. It was, although I went to a minor public school, it was still a bit of a culture shock. Of course, I was a choral scholar at Magdalen, so I spent a lot of my time doing that. And that was challenging. But I eventually decided that in my second year as an undergraduate, I wanted to become an academic, so that's kind of what I wanted to do. And then, of course, I went across to the other side of Oxford to Nuffield, which is a kind of social science college, and David Butler was my supervisor. And that's how I ended up basically getting into the media, because, David was the media don, and he got me into the first election in 1979 election, and the rest is history. I learned a great deal there. That's where my quantitative training comes from, et cetera, et cetera. And I then worked a lot with people who were working in Oxford, even when I kind of moved on to other institutions. So, sure. Like most people who've been here, I owe the place a great deal. There's no denying that.
Psephology. Why did you choose psephology?
Oh, the answer, John, is I really don't know. The only story I can tell you is this. My first political memory is of the death of Hugh Gaitskell in 1963, and triggering, there's this leadership contest going on. And so I began to follow it. And, it's interesting. And Howard Wilson won. He defeated Jim Callan, if I remember rightly. And then I kind of went, there was 64 election. And my parents, those days the polls closed at 9:00. So, how old was I then? 11 or so. My parents were kind of fairly strict about bedtimes, but I was allowed to watch the first hour or so of the election program. And of course, in any case, in those days, a lot of the counts were on day 2. And I remember following on the radio the following day, because I was out and about. And I just thought this was interesting, but. How can I explain this, John? Well, my mother in the end did become a local councillor, but all of that came much later. And there were some political discussions within the broader family, but I could hardly argue that, it was a political hotbed. And my father was certainly completely uninterested in it all. So it's very difficult to explain, but this process of elections just somehow or another grabbed me.
You come into the tradition of Bob Mackenzie and David Butler. I went to the LSE, and Bob Mackenzie, you might remember him, was Canadian. You could tell when he was appearing on television, he wore a yellow shirt, because in those days yellow was white.
Sure, yeah.
And when I joined the BBC, I was in a room with him, and I said, "My name is John Mayer. I went to the LSE and you taught me." He looked at me, he said, "Look where it got you."
There we go.
But let's talk a bit about elections. You've done elections since 79.
Yeah.
So how many general elections have you done?
Well, you can count, can you? 79, 83, 87, 92, 97, 01, 05, 10, 15, 17, 19, 24. I think that's a dozen.
Right. What's the excitement of them for you? Because you're up from 10 o'clock.
Well, these days the excitement tends to be that bloody exit poll has said something completely unexpected again. Could it possibly be right?
Can I just stop you a second? Can you explain the mechanics of the exit poll to people? Because they probably don't understand it.
Yeah, okay, fine. Well, it's quite complicated. So the exit poll since about 2005 has been done very, very differently. So essentially, doing exit polls is very different inside the UK, because we don't have what the Americans call precinct level counts. We don't count the votes at polling stations. In virtually every other country, you would be absolutely, utterly reluctant to allow an uncounted ballot box to go wandering around the countryside to the count in the sure and certain knowledge that it would arrive as the same ballot box that left the polling station. All right?
Especially in the third world.
But we do that, and you can blame the Victorians. The Victorians felt it was a way of maintaining the secrecy of the count. So, but that means, therefore, we don't know how individual polling stations counted. Exit polls can only have to take place in a sample of polling stations, a rather small sample of polling stations, because it's very expensive. And therefore, it's you just don't know whether any sample is representative. So an important observation by David Firth, who was a statistician, who is a statistician, who's was involved with the BBC for a while. And his crucial observation was, well, look, it's very, very difficult to estimate the level of party supports from an exit poll, but you can estimate the change if you go and do an exit poll in the same place that you did it last time. Because the point is that the change, although there's a lot of variation from Wick to St Ives about the level of party support, it doesn't vary so much in terms of change. And certainly pretty much any sample of polling stations, particularly if you then analyse it for the geographical variation that you uncover, pretty much any sample of polling stations will enable you to work out the geographical variation in the change in party support. So actually it's not one exit poll, it's two. It's this time's exit poll as compared with last time. And basically we get about 130 estimates of the change in party support from individual polling stations which are located in different kinds of constituencies.
People fill in a ballot paper.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we just ask people to fill in a mock ballot paper. And not everybody will, but and it doesn't matter. And the other advantage of this method, see, it doesn't matter if for example, Tory voters are just picking up your shy Tories. So if Tory voters are less willing to respond to the exit poll and fill in our ballot paper, it doesn't matter so long as their relative propensity to do so is exactly the same as it was at the last election, because we're estimating change, not level, okay? So in other words, all the possible biases that there might be in the exit poll don't matter so long as the biases are constant from one exit poll to another. And this is part of the reason why in the end the exit poll has proven to be, since we've changed that methodology, pretty close. But inevitably, some of the excitement is...
When do you know the result?
We've got a pretty good idea at 2:00 in the afternoon.
And then you call in the editors of the program.
No. It's kept under wraps much longer than that. No. Because, there is a certain law that says you're not allowed to reveal what you've learned about how people come up.
You do 9:30, 9:45. They do.
Yeah. It has to be that late. But the point is, it will move after 2:00, but the broad picture we've got a sense of. So the excitement. So part of the excitement is, have we got it right or not? For which I go, and these days I go, thank God for Twitter, or whatever you want to call it these days, because you see that the journalists who in the count are beginning to give you a clue as to what's going on. That, together with the OBs, the outside broadcast, where the intelligent journalist is able to give you an idea of the mood without contravening the representation of the people by actually saying what's going on.
Talking to the party agents.
So that's part of the excitement. The other, the most exciting election in my experience was 1997. Partly because although the polls had pointed to a substantial Labour victory, nobody believed them because the polls had got it wrong in 1992. And of course, what was also, and people certainly didn't believe that Labour, that Conservative cabinet minister after Conservative cabinet minister would fall. And I well remember it was about 2:00 in the morning when Michael Portillo lost. And of course, there was a book written afterwards, Were You Up for Portillo? And I well remember there was my producer that year was a guy called Sean O'Grady, who went on to write for The Independent and still does. And Sean's job was to keep on egging me to think of psephological nuggets to feed to the people who were in front of camera. And I said to Sean, sit down, shut up. We are not going to get anything on air for the next 2 hours. this is the drama of the night, because of course we had Portillo, we had the picture of Gillian Shepherd looking ashen-faced, and then thereafter I think in the end it was 8 cabinet ministers. Now the truth is, of course, there was an even bigger decline last time. But until Liz Truss lost her seat, and of course she had to be got out of a cupboard in order for the declaration to be made, because she was hiding away, and that was rather late. It was 6 o'clock, so there wasn't the same drama. And because the exit poll had pretty much told you what was going to happen, I think it's fair to say, to some degree, we kind of told you what was going to happen before it happened, and it just played out as you would expect it. So I think 2024 was in some senses not as exciting, even though of course you did have the remarkable fragmentation.
Television, you're looking for the reaction shots and you see them, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
How do you keep going all bloody night long?
Adrenaline. I mean, it's...
Do you have a bed to sleep on? Do you go and have a nap?
No. I mean, actually general elections are not too bad, because these days it's all over by lunchtime the following day. So you just go through the night. And of course, it's true we've worked all day, because the exit poll is all day. And then you go through the night. But the answer to you is, John, well, I mean, there are 2 challenges. One is what you talked about, which is the exit poll right or not, and trying to work out whether that's true or not. But then more broadly, I mean, with any election, it's the data are coming in, and what you're trying to do is to make sense for people, so Labour wins Sunderland South. So what? What do we make of it? Okay, and particularly given our electoral system, you have to understand the psephology to be able to work out what might this mean in terms of where this election is going. That's part of what the exit poll is about. So it's getting hold of the story and working out what is the story, and then be able to explain it to viewers. And particularly when we come to local elections, well, we think we know what's going to happen, but very often we don't. It's much more uncertain. So it's literally the intellectual challenge of a flow of data and being able to interpret them with a reasonable degree of accuracy, and to be able to tell the story. And of course, what we're doing is we're trying to tell the story as opposed to the spin that, from their point of view, quite rightly, the various party representatives will be putting on the results.
You're dealing with TV producers who are numerate idiots, by and large.
No, they're not that well. The current editor, he's been the editor now for a good decade now, he's called Sam Woodhouse. He is statistically literate. He understands the methodology of the exit poll, and he understands what we do, and actually values what we do. But John, bear in mind, but the service that we're providing, it's not just for television. I mean, one of the things that it kind of took a while, but one of the things that, as I've been involved in providing a part of the results service for many, many years, is it is now a cross BBC service. So we are as in keen to support Radio 4 and Radio 5 and Radio Derby and BBC Scotland, etc., etc. And indeed, I will sometimes, apart from intervening in a television programme, will intervene on Radio 5 or BBC Scotland or whatever. It is a BBC, so therefore we will sometimes say to the TV folk, no, you're not going to get that now because we're doing something for X.
How did you get from behind the scenes to fronting?
Essentially because it's primarily to do with it's partly to do with the decision of the editor. So what had been tending to happen is Peter Kellner was sitting with us amongst the psephological team, and Peter was doing the face-to-camera stuff. But then basically Sam Woodhouse decided, well, we'll just put a camera in front of this guy instead. And that, together with, of course, with the independence referendum, Scotland's a small country. There aren't many psephologists in Scotland, so, I'm just basically ubiquitous. So it's partly an editorial decision. I was occasionally on before I get wheeled on the Friday or whatever. But actually, you might like this. I think actually having worked on and still work on the production side of television means that, you have much more influence. I mean, there's nothing worse in my view, as being a guest who's had no control over the programme and told to sit in the middle of this studio, which is like a spaceship, where you have absolutely no control, and you've kind of got to opine. The great thing about being involved in the production side is you're involved in the development of how the program is going to work, etc., etc.
You rehearsed for a week?
Oh yeah, sure. And again, also what I'm doing, I mean, although there's a system whereby what I think is going on is disseminated throughout the whole of the BBC in written form. So, and of course, these days BBC Online is an important customer as well. So, it's partly, but again, everybody says, oh, well, it's me that declares the exit poll. It's not actually. It's never me that declares the exit poll. I get wheeled in after a while saying, how the hell did you manage to come up with those figures? The presenters do, because, I mean, sometimes I'm usually not even anywhere close to a studio at that time.
Let me ask you a tech question. Do you get Omni talkback or Switch talkback in your ears?
Yeah, I get Omni and Switch talkback.
He hears everything that's going on.
Yeah, I see. So I basically, I mean, you know how to do it. So I have Studio Out, which is the program, coming in one ear. In another ear, I have got it on low, but I can hear both the editor and the director to the program. Because these are the folk who are giving instructions, because that tells me where the program might be going. And then also, through both ears, you hold conversations with producers, some of whom might be in the same room as you, but because the way things work these days, many of them are in a different part of the building. So you've got to be able to hold three things at once. But then sometimes if I'm trying to concentrate, I will have somebody who's sitting next to me and I say, listen to it. And if somebody's coming across or something important happens, tells me, because I'm having to concentrate on something that's quite difficult. But yeah, you've got to be able to cope with many voices. As you know, it's part of the art.
The great sports presenters cope with lots and lots in their ear and know which voice to listen to, don't they?
Yeah, sure. And that's in part, you prick your ears when you hear something being said on air that sounds important. I mean, much of the rest of the time, I don't know what's been said because I've been either concentrating myself or I've been listening to the editor or talking to other people. I mean, sometimes I must sit down and watch the programme because I've never watched an election programme ever since I've been involved in it.
My first job in television was working for Robin Day, and he would often lose his earpiece because he didn't believe the producers should have any influence on him. So he would break
that, of course, is a well-known presenter's trick. Yes, indeed.
You had a question, yes?
Sorry, I don't want to undermine your whole thing here because I have very little compared to you. But I guess, is it really a two-party system that's being challenged? Or is it the party system as a whole that's being challenged? And instead we're moving more towards a presidential system where voters are actually sticky to the leader rather than sticking to the parties.
Yeah, my answer to you is that leaders are the principal mechanism through which voters learn about parties. But, I mean, I did some research on this a while ago. I mean, sometimes the personal popularity of a leader boosts a party a bit, and sometimes it doesn't, right? And there's no consistent pattern. But I think the point is, in the end, it's very difficult to separate the two because, what do we know about the Labour? What most people know about the Labour Party at the moment is through the vehicle of Keir Starmer. Okay, so that's point back. Second point I made to you: the one reason why we definitely know we don't have a presidential system is what happened in July 20. I'm trying to get my years right. July 2022. Boris Johnson's government collapsed. That was parliamentary government, right? And whatever happens to Trump is very, very difficult to get rid of. But the point is that Boris Johnson lost the confidence of his parliamentary party. He could no longer form a government, which is the quintessential requirement for any leader. So he had to go, right? And then Liz Truss was dispatched as well, right? So that's a fundamental feature of our system. And I think what happened to Boris Johnson very firmly confirmed that we have parliamentary and not presidential government.
But have we become a sort of consumer PM? We just say, we don't want that PM, let's find another one.
No, because in the end, although, Boris, the Partygate undermined Boris Johnson's popularity of his party and his personal popularity. In the end, what did for Boris Johnson was the very, very SW1 issue of Conservative MPs being told by Lord MacDonald, well-known Remainer, that ex-Foreign Office head, that Boris Johnson had been told about the somewhat dubious personal behaviour of the then Deputy Chief Whip, Mr. Pincher, and that therefore Number 10's claim that Boris did not know was not correct. And the point is that the one thing you can't do with MPs is to lie to them about their whips. So it's very, very internal, right? Sure, there is the backdrop, but it's not, whereas at the moment, I mean, the conversation we're just having about Starmer, it is a conversation about should the Labour Party get rid of Starmer because of their position in the polls, right? Now, and equally, with Liz Truss, Liz Truss was gotten rid of because, again, basically, because of the way in which she caused a crisis in the markets, her parliamentary colleagues were no longer willing to support her. And again, you see, Ian Duncan Smith didn't survive because his parliamentary party was no longer willing to support him. I mean, it's not. I mean, these incidents of where people have been turned down are to do with, so far, have been to do with manifest failings of governance of doing the job, rather than simply to do with their popularity.
Anybody? Just a last question from anybody? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Oh, we got 2 or 3 here. Yeah, go on.
Would you like to comment on the fact of the age demographic, and the Conservative Party?
Yes.
Are they going to survive if all their members die off? To some extent, what about reform?
Those survive, their members die off.
So the point is about the age problem. Sure. Well, the answer to is that at some point the Conservative Party is going to have to convince middle-aged voters at least to vote for them. Yeah, sure. Now, there's good reason to believe that this is a generational difference, and that therefore they do face quite a substantial challenge. There was one. Yes.
Well, yes.
Okay. Right. Fine. Yeah, I'm looking this way.
Is that Jim Naismith? Stand up, Jim, please.
Then we'll come to yourself. Yeah.
John, one of the features of the Scottish referendum, and to some extent the Brexit, was previously non-voting voters becoming excited to vote and engage.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between some of the parties, the enthusiasm will translate or not to people turning up to vote?
I think that, the one piece of evidence I can cite to you is that those polls that give us the information, and most of them don't, suggest that Reform are doing particularly well amongst those people who did not vote in 2024. But then the question is whether or not they will turn out to vote this time. I mean, certainly, virtually nobody who supported Reform last year has changed their mind. So they've certainly got a very committed band of supporters. But we'll wait and see whether or not that makes any difference in terms of the actual share of the vote they managed to get. There's a lady over here.
Lady at the back, yes.
About talking about popularity, I just wondered if you had any comment on Badenoch's performance yesterday, and whether it might change her popularity in the party. And
well, the broad answer I would give to you, because I'm not sure whether I want to get into how Kemi Badenoch dealt with the Chancellor. We can have that conversation privately about perhaps. But I think Kemi Badenoch has certainly got better at the day-to-day tactics of politics. She's got better at PMQs. The gig, it's the first time she'd done the gig on the budget, because she wasn't leader last time. It's a very, very difficult gig to do. And certainly, landed a few blows, both personal and political. And she's got much better at doing the clips. You've got to be able to do the 20-second thing that will go to a clip into what the people will call a package, which is basically a story of 2 or 3 minutes film. What I think is still missing is the narrative, the story, the vision. I think she's learnt that it's no good trying to outperform Reform. They've obviously realised they need to try to focus on the economy, but we don't as yet have a Conservative vision as how to get the economy out of the mess that is different from the Labour vision, other than at the moment a little bit about trying to lower taxes. But the problem there is Who was it who increased taxes the last Parliament? It was the Tories, right? The Tories presided over the biggest expansion of the state since 1945. And whether or not any of this stuff is simply saying lower taxes, more growth is really an adequate answer is kind of debatable. It's certainly a very old tune.
Yes.
Yeah, you said that the centre has collapsed. It seems to me that the key reason why it collapsed is because Labour completely underestimated the extent of the damage, the distrust caused by 10 years of Tory austerity. And rather than really taking that on board and trying to rectify it, they just carried on making mistakes themselves. And
Well, let's just bear in mind. I mean, if you read your OBR report, public spending as a percentage of GDP is heading to the 44-45% mark, which is a record high since the 1960s, 1970s, and taxation as a proportion of GDP is going to an all-time high of 38%. I mean, the message from Labour yesterday was we're embracing tax and spend, and that's certainly what, in practice, what they're doing. Of course, they had hoped that they would only have to embrace spend because they would get more taxes out of economic growth. And although they've had a bit of a bonus in the last few months, which is one of the reasons why Rachel's had a few goodies. Otherwise, it's not true. But again, I'm glad you said 10 years of austerity. 10 years of austerity is fine. 14 years of austerity is simply a misrepresentation of what happened under the Conservatives. I mean, the Conservatives believe that one of the reasons why they did so badly in 2024 is because they spent so much money in the last Parliament.
Actually, the question I wanted to ask is, given that the centre has collapsed, and we've now got the extremes, if you like, Reform and Greens doing very, very well, is there any chance that we might enter a phase of a new duopoly rather than fragmentation?
Well, sure. I mean, of course, one of the fascinating questions about all of this is, are we in the 1920s and that we're simply going to see one two-party system replaced by another? The difference, of course, is that in the 1920s, there was only one new challenger. We have got two new challengers, and the other third party is still kind of kicking around. So, I mean, there's much more fragmentation. I mean, one of the things that was true about 2024, which people tend to miss, 2024 was the first election at which 5 political parties fought virtually every constituency. That had never happened before in British history. And the crucial thing now about reform is, if indeed, as they're trying to do, they create a local party organisation everywhere, then you will have 5 political parties with an organisational life, because the Greens have now got something everywhere. The Democrats, that's how they survived the coalition, because they're... And so once you create an organisation with local bases, it's much less likely to wither away entirely, okay? But sure, exactly what is the shape of where we emerge? Very, very uncertain. And we can't discount the possibility that Labour will... Indeed, Chancellor this morning saying, I'm going to do better on growth than OBR saying. We will get the growth. Living standards will go up. And if that happens, some of the elected dissatisfaction improve. If they can get their waiting times yet further than they've managed to do so far, that would also be to their benefit. Maybe Keir Starmer just manages to get his act together a bit more, or they replace him. But we can't discount the possibility of Labour mounting a degree of recovery, and maybe equally the Tories will also. But I guess the implication from remarks however is that they might get back to being key players, but whether they're going to continue to dominate in the way that they once did, that's looking like quite a very substantial challenge.
Last question is mine, something we're both interested in.
I suppose one thing we should say, the two-party system has already been killed in Scotland. So, I mean, that's the indication that it can happen here. And it's also worth bearing in mind that we have been virtually unique in England and Wales in actually still having, until now at least, more or less the same party system as we had in 1945. Virtually every country in mainland Europe, Spain, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, their party systems are all fundamentally different from what they were. And a lot of the changes happened in the last 20 years. What's so different about this country?
Catch up. What are the polls?
Yes, it has two parties.
Well, yeah, yes, but of course, the structure means the Republican Party's changed its character. But yeah, sure.
Last question. What do the polls tell you about the BBC and trust in it?
It's a while since I've checked, actually, John, but usually the polling suggests that the BBC is the most trusted news organisation in the country.
Still?
I've not seen anything since the whole current row.
Fascinating hour and a half. Would you put your hands together and thank John very much indeed?
Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you.